Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Youth Rights Podcast. I am your host, Zane Miller, and today we are going to be talking to Mike Males today. And also here with another NYRA volunteer, Ian. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ian Golek. I've been volunteering with NYRA for over a year now, and I just recently wrote a blog article that's going to be published around the same time of this podcast about how growing age restrictions in places that are supposed to be open to the public. And I referenced some of Mike's work in that article. I've known about and respected his work for quite a while. So why don't you introduce yourself, Mike?
Well, I'm Mike Males. I got into youth work in the 1970s, working with the Youth Conservation Corps and in families and community programs, and got a PhD in social ecology at UC Irvine, and have since been very interested in the sociology and rights issues surrounding young people, especially today. I'd have to say, back then it was things like crime and drugs and all the issues back then of the 80s and 90s, but now. Because crime and drug abuse have gone down so much among youth, we now have to find new problems to blame on young people. And that's where we're getting into the areas of defending social media use, curfews, things like that. All the issues surrounding mental health and the repressive things that are being done with that. So, my issues have changed a whole lot. Also, I've been a promoter of Vote at 16. I think it's kind of essential because unless you have some kind of power, you're not going to have any rights.
Yeah, when you were starting back in the 80s and 90s, kind of the prevailing attitude toward young people then was we have to get tough and have all these harsh punishments. And now it's there's this kind of fake sympathy with stuff like it's about protecting their mental health, or to like ban cell phones or have more increasing the schooling requirements or things like that. And it might sound more sympathetic, but it's still motivated by a desire to control their behavior that's still there. So why don't you talk about some of these issues that are going on now?
One of my heroes from the 1950s is an educator named Edgar Friedenberg, and also anthropologist Margaret Mead, and they both said basically the same thing, that hostility against young people is typically expressed as concern. So this has been, the idea over a long time that, we got to curfew these young people and get them out of public because we're so concerned for their safety. Or like you say, in every generation, they bring up the issue that mental health is a terrible problem, that it never was before among young people. They said that about my generation in the 60s and 70s. They said it about every generation since, and it's just been a regular. In fact, they said it before that, all the way back to the turn of the century, the early 1900s. They were talking about mental health being a terrible problem among young people, and they would always express it with the idea that, well, in order to do this, we've got to take away young people's rights. They just have too many rights. Whatever I think is wrong with society is what's wrong with young people. So we got to fix what I think is wrong with society, and we've got to restrict young people more. And so today, of course, with the rise of social media, that's happened over the last 30 years. I don't know, political extremism has really become much worse than it was even in the 80s and 90s. We think of that as being a turbulent time. But of course, back then, the idea, and they really had some statistical basis back then, although, the real problem with young people in the 80s and 90s was high rates of poverty, also exposure to lead in impoverished environments and things like that. And actually, we found out through a natural experiment that if you reduce poverty and reduce lead exposure, why, amazingly, a lot of the things that we were calling youth problems and juvenile problems went down so dramatically in the 2000s and even into Generation Z that we no longer can logically call these youth problems anymore. Crime is now a much bigger problem among people in their 30s and even their 40s than among teenagers. Violent crime is much higher among people in their 30s than it is among teenagers. That didn't used to be the case, but since they have reduced the poverty level among youth to that comparable to adults, lo and behold, youth crime came down, and we've had many remarkable improvements. School dropout even dropped very dramatically over that period, and what we call teen pregnancy, which has always been a misnomer. We can get into that some, if you want, but that came down dramatically. So Today's young people, Generation Z, your generation, is doing everything right according to the 80s and 90s, admonitions. And yet there almost seems a taboo in social science, academics, and political leaders, and so forth, in talking about these vast improvements, such as the 90% drop in youth crime, as if there was almost a law against talking about these things. And the reason, of course, is the same anti-youth hostility prevails today that existed then. Only now, it has to shift to things like, oh, well, we're so concerned about their mental health.
And yeah, one of the main issues today that, people like to act as a youth issue is like social media exposure, and they like to act like social media is such this like evil for young people and that they need to be banned off of it and censored from it. And, something that Naira has always argued in the past is that social media is overall more beneficial for young people, and it has the potential to have a lot of more benefits on young people's lives than it does to have any negative consequences. And I know you've written about that a bit before. So talk a bit about like social media, like restrictions for minors, and like why do you think this is happening? Why do you think there's such like a push to target young people with these social media laws, and what do you think is the effects of it?
Well, almost anything that allows young people to interact with each other, independent of adult supervision, especially girls. There's always, you'll notice, the very intense concern that young women are extremely damaged by any kind of freedom. This has been a constant refrain over many decades, but now it's sort of reached a fever pitch with social media, that they're in danger, that there are predators out there. There's all kinds of deleterious messages, and their delicate mental health is being harmed. And really what they're alarmed about, I really think the underlying thing is I don't think larger society, adult society, is concerned about teenage mental health. I don't think that if they were, then we would see much more attention paid to things like family dynamics, oppressive schools, lack of economic opportunity for young people. So we would certainly be looking at those things. But no, those things have been shoved off the table, and then we just talk about social media and, that being the problem. So I think a lot of this concern is, to be honest with you, I think it's phony. And having worked in social science for 40 years, I think a lot of the concerns that you see expressed loudly and publicly are not the real concern. The real concern is, first of all, has always been, but now is especially intense, of independent young people. They hate that idea, and especially girls. You see a tremendous attack from conservatives in particular, but also among many liberals, that independent young people, independent girls are ruining society. They're not having babies the way they're supposed to and keeping up the birth rate. They're invading all kinds of territory they shouldn't be in. They're leaders in global activism, taking over college campuses, moving into career fields that, they're displacing men from many jobs and those kind of things, and really succeeding beyond any previous generation, which you got to think is kind of funny, because if they're really as depressed as they're made out to be, why they should be sitting on their couches, snarfing cookies and cream. And girls are out in society too much, and their activism has been alarming people. And you really see the drumbeat against independent girls really throughout history, but especially firing up over the last 30 years with books like Reviving Ophelia and some of the our girls are getting out of control, we got to do something, and they're getting violent, and they're getting all this and all that, none of which was supported by statistics or any kind of research. It's just a fear. So I think that's mainly the concern. And the other thing is that young people use social media, and older people obviously use social media for organizing. Use it for political organizing, activist organizing. It was always depicted as, well, the Chinese, ultimately own. Yeah, TikTok, the Chinese own TikTok. The Chinese were going to use it to spy on us, when in fact everyone with any knowledge knew that the Chinese could just buy the information and obtain the information they were getting on TikTok from anywhere else, from any other. I mean, Facebook was far more intrusive in terms of the amount of information it made available. So they were not upset. That was the ruse that some of them, especially Democrats, put out there as being their reason for wanting to break up TikTok and sell it to an American owner. Was that it's the Chinese. The Chinese are going to use it to find out about Americans. Really, what they were concerned about was that young people were expressing or finding out things on TikTok that they weren't finding through mainstream media. Their media choices were becoming more independent, especially with regard to the Israel-Gaza situation and also climate change. And those two things really ticked off Congress. And you really see a lot of them just admitting it, that, well, that's why we decided. It's all this really political stuff that made us decide that we want to really abolish TikTok and turn it over to an American owner that will be tame, that will uphold the interests of those in power. And there really wasn't a lot of secret about that. And I think that we have seen that expand and expand to the idea that even in the 80s and 90s, where officials thought they had to make some kind of argument, even if it was a bad argument, for restrictions on young people, today it's just like, oh, hell, we can do it, so let's just do it.
And I like what you mentioned about how if we're actually going to focus on mental health, we should be focusing a lot more on like family dynamics and stuff like that. Because I've known a lot of people who their personal experience has been that they were in poor mental health because of issues that were happening in their family, and living in abusive homes, abusive environments, very toxic family dynamics. And then one of the main ways that they were able to like cope with that is by using social medias, by like coming into online communities, online support systems, because they didn't have a strong support system, in their real life. So one of the things that I would say is like one of the main harms of getting rid of social media or restricting social media for young people is taking away their ability to access like online communities, online support systems, ways that they could actually be improving their mental health when they're currently having poor mental health due to external circumstances that are happening in their environment. So I was curious if you've done any research into this at all, and if you've seen like trends related to that about poor mental health coming more from like family dynamics and stuff like that, and just kind of elaborate more into that. That interested me when you said that.
Well, that's what most of my Substack has been concerned with, actually. It amazes me. The Centers for Disease Control, our major health agency, that's the major health agency in the United States, has been doing surveys of teenagers with all these 100 questions, and then it would survey 10,000, 20,000 teenagers every year in high school, well, every other year in high school. And they started in 1993 or maybe it was 1991 with these surveys, and they've continued right up to the present every 2 years. Never occurred to them to ask about, say, what's the abuse situation in your family? What's the violence situation? What's the drug addiction situation, the mental health situation among parents and grown-ups around you? Didn't ask that till 2021. And sure enough, when they finally started asking that question, they found that about 2/3 of teenagers were reporting psychological abuse at home from grown-ups. About 1/3 were reporting violence in their homes. 40% reporting poor mental health among parents and caretakers. 1/3 or more were reporting drug abuse, drug and alcohol abuse. And 1 in 5 had parents and grown-ups in their home who had actually been jailed. And sure enough, if you cross-tab those responses, you found out those are the ones that are suffering poor mental health. And the fact is, we know that drug abuse in society, especially among people from their late 20s to their 50s, concentrated in parent ages, have skyrocketed over the last 25 years. Opiate abuse, fentanyl abuse, which is an opiate, and other forms of abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, have skyrocketed. Hospital emergency cases, deaths in the middle-age groups have gone up, and those are the ones parenting teenagers, or the ones who are partners of parents of teenagers, or close relatives, or teachers, or coaches, and those close to teenagers. Mm-hmm. And so when teenagers' mental health problems started going up, they started saying, more of us suffer frequently poor mental health, more of us are chronically sad during the 2010s. From about 2010 to about 2022, 23. By the way, what was going on in the early 2020s that might explain some of that. They said, and observing this taboo, that you must have noticed that it's completely forbidden to talk about these family dynamic issues, in terms of teenage mental health. You cannot connect the two. The only thing you can talk about today in terms of teenage mental health is social media. And so that's what they blame on. And again, there's so many ironies here that it's incredible. Social media use actually peaked, actually got very high around 2009. That's when it really reached about 90% saturation among teenagers. And it hasn't, gotten much higher since 2009. But we have seen mental health problems increased rapidly in the 2010s among teenagers, and also commensurate with drug and alcohol abuse problems among their parents and grown-ups around them. And so we had a perfectly logical explanation in the early 2020s from these CDC surveys as to why teenagers, especially girls and especially LGBTQ teenagers, were more depressed. And that was because they were increasingly in homes with parents and adults who abused alcohol and drugs, who had mental health problems, who were more abusive. And then we had the COVID pandemic and, all kinds of things like that. And I think, we could probably, although we haven't surveyed this very well, look at things like school disruptions as well and difficulties at school. But anyway, teenagers told us loud and clear on the 20 and 21 and 2023 CDC surveys, adolescent health surveys of thousands of students, that this is why we're depressed, especially girls, very clear about that. Social media is not the reason. But as you said, and to get to the second point you made, teenagers who have difficulties at home, especially, we found this again on the CDC surveys very clearly, and other studies have found it as well. Teenagers who are having difficulties at home use social media more than teenagers who don't. And they have to have these online communities. They really need them for health and companionship. And, we've even done surveys, Pew Research has done surveys indicating that teenagers use social media to connect with others, to keep up with what their friends are doing, to connect with people who can help them through tough times. That was a specific question that Pew asked. And a majority of teenagers said, yes, that's one of the reasons that we go online. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. So you have this twin situation going on of teenagers suffering more difficult families, more chaotic, more drug abusing families. And at the same time, those teenagers that suffered those particularly troubled families were the ones who were going online more. So what a lot of people like Jonathan Haidt and Gene Twenge, both of whom are spearheading these movements to ban teenagers from social media, did is they just left out the whole abuse question. They left out the family dysfunction question. They just said, we're not, they didn't even have the courtesy to say, we're not going to talk about that. They just didn't talk about it. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the media, political leaders, and everyone, including a lot of political leaders I admire on in other areas, have just gone along with this and just said, well, no, it's just social media. That's the problem. There's these predators. There's these, untoward messages. There's these terrible sites that teenagers can access and so forth. And that's what's causing the problem. And we got pretty clear evidence social media is not the problem.
So sometimes in response to these concerns about social media, and it's, their teens are spending too much time online, one response is, well, they should just be going outside and, playing sports with their friends or whatever it is that adults did in their own childhood decades ago. Why is it harder for young people today to do that?
I got to laugh. What adults were doing in their childhoods 30, 40, 50 years ago was they were plopped in front of a TV set. And you can go back and look at, they use screens just as much, but of course TV is a much more passive form of entertainment. That's where teenagers of that era, Jonathan Haidt's era and Gene Twenge's era, were spending a lot of their time was in front of TV sets. They weren't exactly out, hiking the Klondike either. In 2004, some documentarists in Los Angeles decided they would do a study of how teenagers use social media. And of course, Los Angeles, that's kind of the apex of social media use in the country, apex of, Hollywood and entertainment and all those kinds of things. And so they followed this group of rather affluent high schoolers around for several months and documented how their lives went. And what they showed was not all what they intended to show. They would have the same alarmist rhetoric. Oh my gosh, they're spending this time in front of screens and they're using their cell phones and, there's this and there's that. But what they really showed was teenagers interacting pretty much the way they always had. Lots of interaction at malls, at coffee shops, personal conversations, in face-to-face conversations, and those kind of things. So social media was much more of a supplement to their social lives than it was taking over their social lives. And having said that, I think there's probably, I don't know, 10% of teens and adults that say they have serious problems with social media. And I believe you, get off social media if you feel like you have a problem with it. But the other 90% find it varying degrees of useful. And I really kind of like what teenagers express on Pew Research surveys, that social media is neither good nor bad. It's just a tool. It just depends on how you use it. It's like anything else. It's like books. You can read good books or bad books. You can watch good TV shows that enlighten you and inform you, or you can watch trash. It's the same thing throughout life. But because social media is relatively new, or it can be made to seem new to older generations, then we've got the ripe ingredients for a panic. Oh my gosh, rock and roll and rap music are destroying our teenagers, or crusade of the 1980s. It's really taking advantage of that kind of paranoia. When really, if you look at that era, you look at this era, teenagers have basically the same problems: high rates of poverty, high rates of family dysfunction, and those are the ones that we should really be most concerned about.
Yeah, and then when it comes to also like another, like with that same argument of like, oh, why don't teenagers just go outside and do this and be like, because they always act like teenagers nowadays don't spend enough time like in person or outside. There's a thing that I always like to come back to when people are making that argument, is there's been such an anti-youth push for things in public. And like what Ian mentioned before about how like there's public spaces that used to be available for teenagers that they're simply just being restricted from now, including like malls, where a lot of malls have like banned unaccompanied teenagers, and there's like restaurants, stores that do the same thing, and they make it to where teenagers aren't able to just hang out in public. So then obviously if they can't go to like physical locations, then they're going to be spending time on social media with each other, because they can't just like go to the mall because they're literally not allowed to. So like what's the connection between these like restrictions of teenagers in public spaces and these other things we've talked about? Like, have you like seen any of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a dual campaign. In the 80s and 90s, and especially in the 90s and early 2000s, there was very uh, high rates of curfew enforcement. And uh, tens of thousands of teenagers were arrested for curfew violations in California alone, say around the years 1999 or 2000. Very heavy enforcement back then. And we had the same things back then. We had restrictions on teenagers going to malls. They couldn't be in certain places in public. We started to see teen driving laws that said, well, you can't have other teenagers in your car if you're driving. You can't drive at certain times of the day. You have to go through this cumbersome process of having your parents drive with you. And believe me, parents are not always the best influences on teenagers in terms of driving or other things. So anyway, it was kind of these one-size-fits-all laws, and they were very repressive. And there were studies of them, and I will give the research community a lot of credit. They did discover curfews have no effect. If anything, they make life more dangerous for teenagers, because, shocker of shockers, more teenagers in public actually makes public places safer. And we did a study of actual curfew citations, hundreds and hundreds of curfew citations, and discovered that what curfews do is they occupy police time, waste police time, taking law-abiding teenagers off the streets, and where they leave emptier streets and less police presence, which of course fosters more crime. And sure enough, nearly all of these cities had actual increases in crime. And what we found from these curfew citations, because the police were actually good enough to have written on the citations what the teenagers were doing when they arrested them. And they were playing basketball in the park, they were coming out of a restaurant, they were coming out of a movie, they were going home from work. They were doing just regular things. I think out of 500 curfew citations that we looked at, only one involved any kind of suspicious activity. One out of 500. I don't know if you get 500 adults, you're going to find that good a record. But anyway, they were arresting them, taking them to the station. The cop had to sit there and wait for them until their parents showed up, had to do all the paperwork and that sort of thing. So researchers found, and I think this is pretty universal, that curfews really don't accomplish any of the benefits in terms of reduced crime, public safety, or any of those things. So curfews kind of went out of style for about 20 years, but now, everything comes back. Everything bad comes back. The curfew movement is now back again in full force, and the excuse is teen takeovers. And we can talk about that, because I actually think you had an interesting sentence, and I want to quote it from your paper on why we use the term takeover when it's teenagers. Whereas you can have a large mob of grown-ups, like during the soccer matches in the United States, the World Cup matches, causing way more trouble. And we don't talk about a grown-up takeover. And we don't talk about restricting all grown-ups from being in public. So anyway, we can talk about teen takeovers if you want to, because I think it's the latest form of public panic. So essentially, just to get to the bottom line of what you're saying here, teenagers can't be anywhere. There's nowhere you can be. You're supposed to be in your bedroom without a computer. And I don't know what I guess you're supposed to, read classical literature or something like that. Of course, an adult is always supposed to be supervising you at all times. Mm. I guess that's the ideal. But the funny thing is, of course, parents don't want to do that. And grown-ups don't want to do that. So they're basically just kind of in this limbo. Well, we don't want you to be anywhere.
That's what we've seen a lot of, what basically seems like all of these policies have been pushing for lately. Talk about teen takeovers and like the panic around that.
It's right back to the 90s. And again, we're talking about a Generation Z that has crime levels that are 85 to 90% below those of Gen X and boomers and even the older millennials were when they were teenagers back in the 80s and 90s or 70s even. We're talking about a teenage population that has vastly lower crime levels, and we can look at reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons, I think, is the reduction in teenage poverty that came about because of some unexpected results of welfare reform. But anyway, I think there's reasons for that we can look at. And we also have less school dropout today than we did back then. And so we have to have another panic. And the panic is basically, as we're seeing, I'd say every day in the press, there's something on this issue of some city that says we have teen takeovers, and we're considering youth curfews, and they just use the word teenager over and over in these things. So I went back and looked at the police statistics from these cities that are supposed to have had a lot of these really big teen takeovers, like Chicago and Detroit and Washington, D.C., and especially Charlotte. Charlotte claims to have had 40 teen takeovers since May. Mm-hmm. So I go to the Charlotte Police Department, like I have the police departments in these other cities, and their statistics are posted by the FBI online. And fortunately, Charlotte police are pretty good at keeping their statistics up to date. And I expect to see like hundreds, if not thousands. I mean, they talked about one teen takeover that had 8,000 teenagers at it. They said teenagers. So I expected to see hundreds or thousands of these, especially since these teen takeovers are being accused of all kinds of shootings and vandalism and public disorder and all these kind of violations. Instead, if you look at Charlotte police statistics for these last 3 months, when they supposedly have 40 teen takeovers of really large size, you can't tell they haven't. There's the arrests peak at around 35 in Charlotte during these months. And so what I've concluded from looking at all of these cities, and they're very consistent. Again, we're talking about Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., Charlotte, any of these cities that have posted police statistics. What we call a teen takeover, what the press calls a teen takeover, and the police call a teen takeover, and of course all the politicians toddle along, is overwhelmingly African Americans in their 20s and 30s who have gathered in large numbers in a public place. There may be a few teenagers, there may be a few people in their 40s or even 50s at these events, but what they are is large groups of African Americans which are scaring the local gentry. I'm talking about white people here in this particular case, white grown-ups. Mm. And so they have substituted this label, and partly as maybe some adults can't, they look at somebody doing something bad and they say that's a teenager, because we don't want to take responsibility on our own age groups for public problems. Mm-hmm. But that's basically what the arrest statistics in these cities are showing overwhelmingly, is these are not teenagers. Very few of the people in quote teen takeovers are actually teenagers, and almost none of them are juveniles. There are a few, again, you will find a few, but almost none of them are. And so then you look at these police statistics and you see almost none of the people they're arresting are under 18. And in fact, very few are under age 20. They're really all in their 20s, concentrated in their late 20s and 30s. And so we're calling these a teen takeover. And so the city council will meet and, they'll berate young people and they'll berate teenagers and then they'll pass a curfew. Well, I figured even in cities that claim these large teen takeovers, that teenagers were actually committing far less than 10% and usually more like around 5% of the criminal offenses. Things like, disorderly conduct or vandalism or arson or shootings or aggravated assault or simple assault, these things that people have connected with teen takeovers. So, and then finally, I just want to go into this idea of why is it called a takeover? What exactly is a person in public? How are you being accused of taking over your right to be in public? How is that a takeover? And, like I talked about earlier, they have had adult events. And in fact, almost every weekend, they have more people in their 30s. That's the peak crime age now and the peak violence ages. And you can say every weekend there is a 30 age takeover of your city or a 40 age takeover, because look at all the people the police arrest for violent crimes, for drug and alcohol offenses, for, one of the things that's puzzled me the most is what are people in their 30s and 40s, which are now the prime ages for vandalism? What are they vandalizing? I mean, can you imagine being 35, 40 years old and going in with your spray paint can or whatever? And so rather than face this fact, and again, I've got to fault my own social science colleagues for this, is we've just decided to keep trying to blame everything on youth because that's what made us popular 30, 40 years ago, and we want to keep being popular.
Some people might respond to that by saying that this reduction in youth crime is proof that laws like curfews are effective at reducing crime. But it sounds like you don't think that argument would hold up.
No, curfews in California basically went down from about 40,000 a year arrests a year at their peak year, which is around 1999. They went down to essentially zero. One thing is that police get sick of enforcing. They just kind of see they're wasting. This is wasting our time. So police may go in and testify at a city council meeting for a curfew, but then, if one gets enacted, they'll go out and try to enforce it with gusto for, a few 6 months, a year. Then they'll get tired of it and they stop enforcing it. And then eventually there's just no more curfew arrests. So they essentially went from 40,000 curfew arrests a year in California in the late 90s to zero. I mean, there was a city here or there that was still arresting somebody for a curfew, but it went to essentially zero. That's the time period youth crime went down the most, and violence among youth. I think homicides went down from something like 600 a year arrests of teenagers, actually of youths, of juveniles, 600 in California every year in the early 1990s, all the way down to 75 to 100 a year. I mean, people don't realize how dramatic this violence and crime drop among young people has been. And so, no, that didn't coincide, with curfews. And then on top of that, you have the research indicating that even specific areas that adopted curfews and tried to enforce them did not have good results with them. So, no, this isn't because of crackdowns. If anything, crackdowns tend to accompany more problems. That's certainly occurred with teen driving laws. I'm sort of for going back to treat teenagers like adults. If you screw up, you get arrested. If you don't screw up, you don't get arrested. I don't understand what's so difficult about that.
And that's a good mindset to have about it, is, treat young people like they're competent and not like they're, need to be put in a glass house or whatever. But, I like one of the things you mentioned earlier, going back to the social media and mental health stuff, about how there's like a taboo around discussing the connection between the toxic home environments and the actions of parents and the abusive parents, and then that effect on youth mental health. And that's why people always default to social media as the main excuse. Um, and you know, I feel like a lot of that comes down to the fact that there is such this like parents' rights movement to like increase the control that parents are allowed to have over young people, and we've seen that a lot recently. With you know, in Texas, for example, passed this Parents Bill of Rights Act recently, and it had a lot of anti-youth, anti-student laws in there. And one of the things that it did is make it to where young people aren't allowed to start or aren't allowed to be part of clubs in schools without their parents' consent. And then they banned LGBTQ aligning clubs at all in schools. And then other things like parents are allowed to opt their kids out of receiving like basic health care in schools. Like they're not even allowed to go to see the school nurse without if a parent opts them out of it. Other things like they can't even see a school counselor without their parents' consent. And then, you know, we've seen that with like a lot of medical autonomy stuff in other states, like specifically in Idaho, there was a law that made that a parent's rights over medical autonomy law that made it to where young people basically couldn't even access the suicide hotline without parents' consent. And I feel like with all of these very anti-youth, pro-parents rights things that are happening, I feel like the people in power, the people pushing this ideology, feel almost threatened by seeing a connection between abusive parents and poor mental health, and that's why there's such a taboo around it. Do you feel like there's also, have you seen that connection between like the push of a parents' rights movement and then, you know, basically tabooing the connection of, you know, harmful parents and the harms that abusive and toxic parents can have on young people?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can think of three examples right away. The first two are the social media trials. We had a New Mexico Attorney General took a bunch of kids' pictures, 13-year-olds' pictures, without their knowledge or consent, by the way, put them online and use them as decoys to see how many predators he could attract. I think he concentrated on Meta and one other site. I can't remember which one it was, Snapchat. I don't know which one, but it was a couple of sites. Okay, well, he attracted a number of predators who were seeking to meet up with these 13-year-olds whose pictures he had posted. Now, does the Attorney General didn't go after these predators? I mean, these are dangerous people. These are the ones that you want to not have your kids or anyone actually contact. No, what he did is he sued Meta for allowing teenagers to use the Meta platform. And absolutely horrific. He won a $375 million judgment. And I thought, here's an attorney general who is allowing child predators to continue to stay free, that he knows about, that he has contact information on. He could notify other jurisdictions. He could go after them himself. And instead, he goes after the social media platform. I mean, it's like going after the telephone. A predator phoned you. Let's ban you from going on the phone. Okay, second one, even worse, was the Los Angeles social media trial. And here you had, and again, Meta had some ruthless lawyers, and they decided, we're going to go after this mother who is suing us because she says her daughter was damaged by social media. Turns out this mother was horrendously abusive. She was violent. She was body shaming. She abandoned her kids. This daughter that testified was abandoned by her father and her mother both. And her mother only conveniently rediscovered her daughter when she was about 20 years old, and they decided to sue Meta. There was some bucks to be made here. And so anyway, they sued Meta and blamed Meta for all of the girl's problems. And sure enough, she had a social media account and, all kinds of things. But it was clear that the abusive mother was, and by the way, this girl had a sister, and the sister committed suicide. That's how bad these parents were. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this lawyer suing Meta couldn't find any better. I mean, usually you try to find the best case, the most sympathetic case. This was the best case they could find. They won $3.6 million because the jury was only allowed to consider whether Meta or the other plaintiff, and again, I forget the name of the social media company, was responsible. They were not allowed to consider whether the parents were responsible. So they wound up awarding this horrendously abusive mother over, I think it was $6 million when the punitive damages were added in. And absolutely horrendous. So I looked at all the articles and commentaries, and they were all just celebrating this verdict. Oh, victory for kids. Kids are safer now. No, they're not. This was a horrendous, awful decision here that basically rewarded abusive parents. If I had again, I'm going to be very cynical. If I had a screwed up kid, I'd be looking at, well, how much money can I get for saying that kid screwed up because of social media? It appears to be the thing to do nowadays. There's all these mass action suits. There's one going on by attorneys general now. Attorneys general, by the way, are responsible for enforcing and maintaining child abuse registries in their states. They're the ones that should be out front in preventing this family dysfunction that we're talking about. Instead, they're grandstanding and going after social media cases, and because the fact is that we've heard that social media is the big problem now for 10 years. That's winning all kinds of popularity and accolades. But I looked at the articles and I looked at the commentaries on this Los Angeles trial, and not one of them mentioned the abusive mother. Now, some of the media articles did mention, they did contain some of the girl's testimony, which, by the way, is horrendous. And there's a very fine online journalist, Taylor Lorenz, who looks at a lot of these social media controversies, and especially involving youth. And she actually attended the Los Angeles trial. And she said what the girl testified to in terms of abuse by her mother was just horrendous, just awful, horrible. Really, she deserves some compensation for her terrible childhood. California had a very restrictive law. They started out to be like Australia, where will just ban everyone under 16 from social media, take down all the accounts. Well, actually, the Electronic Frontier Foundation and some pretty good groups came in, gay and lesbian groups came in, and they said, look, this is going to really cut off a lot of kids from difficult situations, from social media contacts. And so they amended the bill, and I swear I don't think the oldest lawyer in the world could understand what this bill now says, that you cannot allow a person under 16 on a social media site that has addictive features, and they list what addictive features are, and they just, again, I don't know how anybody can interpret this. So the purpose of this law now is not so much to specify what's harmful as to terrify these social media companies into saying, well, we better just take the most restrictive policy possible, or somebody's going to sue us, or somebody's going to prosecute us. And so it's really this kind of chilling effect that they're going after deliberately, not some kind of specific law that would, protect people. So anyway, it's just kind of an unbelievable situation with social media.
Yeah, and I've liked everything you mentioned with this because, from my own personal experience of the people that I've talked to and the young people that I've known, is it always seems like there is such a big connection between abusive parents, overly strict parents, controlling parents, toxic parents, and wanting to restrict social media. Like, I feel like the young people that I've talked to who have relied on online communities for support, it's always their parents trying to be the ones to take that away from them,
Right.
when they are the parents are also the source of the abuse and the problems that they're experiencing in the first place. And then going off of what you mentioned about the first point about the attorney general, posing as minors to attract predators, and then allowing the predator to basically get away with it. I think we see that a lot, and people don't really give a lot of attention to the fact that, in my opinion, when you put in age verification for social media platforms because of the fact that, we need to protect young people from predators, what that shows to me is that these laws are basically saying that we're letting the predators win. It's basically saying that here's social media, here's the thing that could be very beneficial, but because there's predators, we're basically blaming the victims. We're like, okay, you young people, you're the victims, you're the ones that are being affected by predators, but we're going to take away your rights. We're going to take away your freedom. We're going to take away your ability to access this thing to protect you, which is, in my opinion, that's the same logic as basically saying, oh yeah, if a woman goes out late at night and then gets like assaulted by like a man or something, the authorities respond with, okay, let's ban all women from going out at night instead of targeting going after the people who are assaulting them. And it just makes it seem like they're siding with predators, and basically saying that you were basically running our whole laws based off of this small, very group of bad apples, and we prefer to restrict the rights of all young people and take away the benefits of social media from all of these young people instead of actually focusing on attacking the source of the problem of the things that are harming young people, which I feel like is just such a backwards, like victim blaming way for these laws to operate.
Absolutely. Candace Odgers, who has some TED Talks and an excellent Substack, I think really has a good perspective on this, and she's pretty blunt about it. She just said, look, we grown-ups screwed up public life. We let too many guns and too much social inequality and those sorts of things. So we do have some public dangers. And then we said, well, we got to protect these kids, so we can't let them go out in public. And then we screwed up online life. We said, oh, well, we're just going to allow all these freedoms for adults. We need our pornography, we need our terrible sites, we need our, freedom of expression, that sort of thing, even when it contains actual criminal elements. And so instead of really dealing with that, or actually even admitting it occurs, we're just going to ban young people from those sites. That's our solution to everything. And, I'm kind of a freedom, free speech maximal, free speech absolutist. I really think that let people say what they're going to say and hold them accountable for it. I don't know any alternative. Once you start getting into censorship, and you're really going down a difficult slope here. And then when you talk about banning entire classes of people, because we grown-ups have created such a dangerous public world and a dangerous online world that we just cannot let our young people, unlike almost any other country. I mean, I'm sure Canada's having, their furor over social media, but at least in Canada, teenagers have considerable public freedoms. In other countries around the world. United States, we're just like, now, I really think our attitude is we just don't want to deal with young people. We just want them out of our sight, out of our public spaces, especially Black and brown young people, especially gay and lesbian, transgender young people, especially young people that, we just don't want to see. We just want to lead our own privileged lives. And, and a result of adults leading our own privileged lives is that we get into a lot of trouble. We create a lot of problems. And then we have to say, well, young people can't be in public or online then because, well, we don't admit it, but it's because, in parentheses, we're creating so many problems. I think all these things are interconnected. And I really think Generation Z, the attitudes toward you today, because they are couched in these language of protection, more than in the past. In the past, they were too, but today it's really, they don't really have anything else they can get you on. They can try to get you on crime, or they can try to get you on some this or that. But and believe me, there are earnest efforts to do that. But really, it's like we just don't want to see young people. We certainly don't want to deal with their future problems like climate change and those kind of things. We don't even want to think about that. So the easiest thing to do is just banish them.
And it's kind of like, I would say it's almost like a dystopian way to handle it. It's just like they want to ignore all of the problems and all of the harms that they're causing young people while, basically empowering the things that are causing these harms to young people in the first place, and then blame it on other things. And, it's a lot of scapegoating, I would say. But it's been about almost an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap everything up. But thank you so much for coming on and, sharing your thoughts and your research and everything. Do you have any, last message or last thoughts that you want to leave off on, if you want to, plug your Substack or any of the things you're working on?
Generation Z seems to be doing a good job, not a perfect job, because, of course, no generation is perfect, but a good job of adapting to these current situations. I think there are some harms from social media, and I think Generation Z has been pretty good at taking those on. Learning to adapt to them, learning to deal with them, learning, for instance, how not to meet predators, because, for example, actual predation is so rare that it's a headline whenever it happens, whereas child abuse in the home is so common that the news doesn't even bother to cover it. So it's just kind of the paradox of the news. But Generation Z seems to be adapting very well to these circumstances. They seem to be more than previous generations. Again, there are exceptions, within the generation, but they seem to be recognizing future problems and the kind of what we have to do to live in a multicultural society, in a multicultural world, and those kinds of things more than previous generations. And I think that's exactly the thing that's getting older generations mad and nervous about them, is this idea that we do face a very different future here. Older generations don't want to even think about that. We like things fine just the way they are, with our privileges and our generally higher wealth. and we don't want to think about these challenges that we have to face in the future. And Generation Z keeps reminding us every chance they get that there's terrible conflicts going on in the world, there's climate change coming up, there's social inequalities and things like that that we have to deal with if we're going to live in a society worth living in. And so, again, I don't want to be overly effusive, that, oh, young people will save us all. But I think we are in a situation where Generation Z is better adapted to that reality. You grew up with it than older generations. And that's exactly why we're looking more and more to repression. It's very sad.
Yeah.
It's got to be pretty frustrating for you that you've been writing extensively for years, and it's got research to back all the facts up, and politicians and other people just say whatever they want. And I appreciate that you've continued to tell the truth even when it's not popular or you can't make money off of it.
Right. Yeah. No, this is not a money enriching pathway to take. I will just warn everyone out there right now.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for coming on and kind of debunking these myths about the problems with youth, and really kind of shedding light on what a lot of people don't want to talk about. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Well, thank you for having me, and Naira, keep up the good work.
Yeah, of course. All right, see everyone in the next episode. Bye-bye.